Good evening and welcome. My name is Juan Cruz. I'm Dean of the School of Fine Art here at the Royal College of Art, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Visual Cultures lecture series. This is the second of the Visual Cultures lecture series this year, and the series really is it's the RCA's. It's a public lecture series that we have run and organised from the School of Fine Art. And it's a series where we try and bring our students together with a broader constituency, broader publics, to talk about issues that we think are pertinent to the work that we do in the studios, the things that we teach and the things that we research and try to make discoveries in. Last year in the Visual Cultures lecture series, we looked at the theme of contemporaneity and tried to think about how we articulated this ungraspable concept with help from artists, curators, thinkers, etc., in a way to try and consider how art might be situated in the world today and to think about the kinds of things that artists might be thinking that they were responding to. This year we've tried to be a little more specific than that, and through the series we've tried to consider how we might address more particular issues that might be of concern in the arts, but also more broadly in the broader culture and the broader society. And so with the series this year, we're bringing people together from the worlds of art and other kind of relevant fields to talk about such things as the public sphere, about the economy, culture more broadly, and to try to generate some debate that might lead us to understand better what kind of insights or what kind of contribution our subject, art, might have to broader debates. And this is broadly speaking what we're doing. We're really delighted today to welcome Jonas Staal and Richard Sennett, who are going to be speaking, and my colleague Mel Jordan will be introducing them in a moment and then moderating their discussion. Mel is a reader in Art and the Public Sphere, currently senior tutor in sculpture, but will be leading from next year our public sphere pathway, which will be part of a new program that we're launching next year called Contemporary Art Practice, and about which we're very excited. So I'll just introduce Mel and ask her then to introduce in more detail our speakers for tonight. Thank you very much.
Hello everybody and welcome. So tonight we're very excited to welcome Richard Sennett and Jonas Staal to contribute to the Visual Cultures lecture series for 2015, which we've entitled Rise Up and Envision. So wow, this proves to be an exciting conversation, I think. Some of you know me, some of you don't, but anyway, I'm a bit of an art and politics, art and publics sort of nerd. So not only am I in awe of the significance of the work of our two speakers, I'm very much interested in the proposals and propositions that they have put forward now and previously in order to help us rethink the ways in which we can live collectively. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens when we get them to talk side by side, and then of course when we get them together. So just a brief introduction to our speakers. Jonas Staal is an artist that has studied monumental art in, I'm never going to say all this, in Enschede, the Netherlands, and Boston, USA. He's currently working on his PhD research entitled Art and Propaganda in the 20th Century at the University of Leiden. Staal is the founder of the artistic and political organisation New World Summit that develops alternative parliaments for stateless organisations banned from democratic discourse. And together with Back in Utrecht, of the New World Economy that researches the role of art in stateless political struggle. And Richard Sennett is the Centennial Professor of Sociology at the London School of Economics and University Professor of the Humanities at New York University. He has explored how individuals and groups make social and cultural sense of material facts about the cities in which they live and about the labour that they do. He focuses on how people can become competent interpreters of their own experience despite the obstacles society may put in their way. And I'm going to say something what I think now. So for me, it is clear that Sennett and Staal both share a relationship to critique. However, they both utilise the critical as a method to discover new potentialities for social equality rather than to reveal specific details of monster individuals or political regimes. Critique for Sennett and Staal, and I know I'm pushing it, making these claims, but, you know, I've got a chance, so I will. Critique for Sennett and Staal is the first move towards formulating new ways to act. Although their response to the current state of things is not pragmatic in the common sense dogma of neoliberalism, they are both moved to action and intervention and proffer practical and active ways to enable a rethinking of our subjective agency, and therefore they extend, for me anyway, they extend hope for a new kind of politics. So with no more from me, and of course we want them to talk, so thank you very much and welcome, if everybody could.
No, thank you all for coming. I will time myself because I came to understand that there is an actual time limit. The lecture, the event tonight is entitled Making Worlds. When I was asked to suggest a title, I suggested this title, which is rooted in a book that has been very important for me in the development of my work, which is entitled Mammon Art, written by the American politician and writer Upton Sinclair in 1924. For those not familiar with this book, it's a bit of an obscurity. It is an attempt to rewrite the history of art from the perspective of class oppression. In a polemical way, Sinclair says all art is propaganda, because all art historically has always been subservient to dominant political, religious, and economic forces. But in the year 1924, with the rise of international socialism, a new chance emerges, so he argues. And that is a chance for art to take the side of those who strive for a more egalitarian world. And with that new world comes the possibility of creating a new art. And so he calls upon artists and says, it is time now to abandon your place as artists in the world as it exists, within the status quo as you have been learned to accept it. It is time to make a world, thus making a world. Now the question is, of course, how to make a world. I think that what is a crucial part of the argument of Sinclair is that a world is something that is made in common and in collectivities. And it means that if art wants to have a social or political impact, it means it has to ally itself. It has to ally itself with emancipatory political struggles. And that can take the form of political parties, can take the form of unions, it can take the form of social movements and the like. But a new world, making a world, is not something that happens on an individual basis. I'm going to try to make that proposition or this conviction as concrete as possible by introducing a project which is maybe more of an organization, an artistic and political organization, the New World Summit, that I founded in 2012. We are an organization that consists of about 15 different members from the field of art, design, architecture, philosophy, diplomacy, and we develop what we call alternative parliaments for stateless and blacklisted political organizations. And the image that you see here is an example of such an alternative parliament and temporal architectural construction here in the Sophienseele in Berlin in 2012, the very first summit that we organized. Important place also. This is a theater, but historically it was also used as a political space. Rosa Luxemburg famously pronounced her speeches in this room. And what you see in the design are flags that belong to organizations that today are placed on so-called designated lists of terrorist organizations. Not by chance, they are organized by color, thus forming a large color scheme. And this notion of terrorism, or the notion of the blacklist, I think is today crucial to understand what the concept of statelessness means, especially in the condition in which we are now, the condition of the war on terror. Being placed on a blacklist has the following consequences. One's passport is revoked, a travel ban is installed, bank accounts are frozen, and that means that essentially one is placed outside the realm of democracy. One is declared instantly stateless, a body without a legal or political form of representation. Now the cynical part of that is that many of the organizations that are on these blacklists are already stateless peoples. You can think of the Basque people, the Kurds, the Tamil, who for decades have struggled against colonization for their right to self-determination. So placing a stateless person on a blacklist means that a double negation takes place. One is declared stateless in a twofold way. Now the question that we have asked ourselves as a New World Summit is, at what level can the space of art operate as an imaginary where we re-articulate what the practice of democracy exactly is and how we represent it, how we perform it. If you want to say, take the theatrical context more, and make it more part of this question. So can the space of art be a place where we imagine what we argue for is a limitless democracy? That means that the idea that the blacklist would be a legitimate boundary of democracy as a way to protect democracy from its enemies is actually what destroys it. Limitless democracy is not so much, as we propose, is not so much a form of governance. It's rather the idea that democracy takes place the moment where radically different voices meet on egalitarian grounds. That doesn't mean that the day after, the conflict that exists between them will not continue, possibly even in violent ways. But the specific moment of meeting and making this meeting possible, creating difference between political positions in the world that we inhabit today, this is what the essence of democracy for us is. So we have created the spaces to assemble these voices, this counterpoint to modern, what I would argue for, modern capitalist democracy and its war on terror. Here you see some examples of organizations that spoke at the first summit, from left to right: Basque Independent Movement, Kurdish Women's Movement, Filipino Revolutionary Movement, and the Azawadian Independence Movement, which I will introduce with a little bit of more detail later on. A little bit more about the role of art in this process. I'm going to skip some summits. We organized them in Berlin, in the Netherlands, in Leiden. Here you see the 4th New World Summit in Brussels, took place in 2014 in the Royal Flemish Theatre. On the front of the theatre you see about 20 flags of different unrecognized states. Since the beginning of our organization, we facilitated more than 30 different stateless and blacklisted political organizations from all over the world. And one of the things that was important about this 2014 summit was our attempt to push the aesthetic vocabulary that we developed as an organization in direct collaboration with the groups that we work with. Here you see the enormous variety of forms of claims to political autonomy, statehood, autonomous regions, and the like, that go all the way from East Turkestan to the Al-Awaz, to Oromo, to the Tamil Elam, to Somaliland, to West Papua. You see also that in these maps that we developed together with each of these organizations, the ideas, the visuality of autonomy takes a different form every time. So the summits are also a way to explore not just those that are excluded from our existing political order. The summits are meant to create a space to discover alternative forms of governance and political autonomy, alternative forms of world governance potentially, in the sense that we do function or aim to function as a kind of shadow UN between groups that are currently not recognized within the political order as we know it. This is the design of the parliament, the arena-shaped parliament that we developed in Brussels, and around it you see that these maps that I showed on the previous image are placed throughout the parliament on a very large scale. Now what is important about that is during the performance of the parliament, the taking in use of the parliament, here you see on the left Musa Asarit of the National Liberation Movement of Azawad debating with Shigut Geleta from the Oromo Liberation Front, is that they allow for the form of discussion to change, the vocabulary to change. One of the things that is very difficult when it comes to acknowledging the idea of someone's autonomy is already located in language. For example, continuously we have to explain when we speak of the Basque country that it is the Basque country in Spain, that it is Kurdistan in Turkey, that it is East Turkestan in China. This is of course already a problem, because that instantly delegitimizes the right to self-determination of these specific groups. So we need a language, both spoken but also visual, to argue for an egalitarian relation between them. So the maps that we developed with all of these organizations are an example of that. Now, to give a little bit of an insight of the enormous difference between the types of autonomy independence that are being represented through the summits since 2012, I want to go into first into the unrecognized state of Azawad, represented by Musa here on the left. Now, what is interesting about the case of Azawad, and now I'm going to do it again, currently located in what we currently know as the northern part of Mali, so here's immediately the problem. The region of in the region of the Sahel and the Sahara and the Sahel, a territory of about 1.5 times France, colonized by the French, originally inhabited by the Kel Tamashek, better known as the Tuareg. This is the map of the independent state of Azawad that they have fought for since Malian independence with support of the French throughout 4 revolutions until 2012, when they declared their own independent state. And when we see it as a map, it can be read as a state in terms of what we imagine is the infrastructure of the state. What we imagine is the representation of a state, clear territorial boundaries and the like. But when we go into the territory, and I had the chance to be invited by the National Liberation Movement of Azawad to travel with them a year after they declared their initial independence, is an enormous contrast between the reality of the actual territory and its representation in terms of the map. Immediately shows a lack of capability of the map as a model to recognize the complexity of an actual territorial situation. In this case, we're speaking of a vast territory with inhabitants that go only up until 1.3 million people, I think. And it says something about the actual functioning of the state of Azawad. The Kel Tamashek, as a historically nomadic peoples, never wanted a state. The very model or the language of the nation state is not part of their history. They were forced to speak the language of the state in order to make their different ideas of independence a reality in the eyes of the world community. And thus, we have a map. The reality is a fundamental different one, which I think is beautifully embodied in this photo that Musa made in the first weeks of the independence, which he sent to me at the time, which is this, well, what seems as a empty space, which is of course not an empty space. It's a space that's loaded with history, and in this case with decades of anti-colonial struggle for Azawadian independence. And this canvas, which is of course a flag, but in this case it's not really a flag because it's a painted flag, it's a canvas. In some way it's an abstract work, but not really, because of each of its colors represent a specific phase in the struggle of independence, politicizes the space, makes that this space starts to tell a different history, a history of its own. I think in that sense it's a beautiful artwork in the most political sense of the word. So this shows something about the trickiness also of the form of the map, and it introduces one of the many claims when it comes to structures of independence that we discussed in the summit. In this case, a state that essentially would be drawn on a map, but would continue to function in a originally confederate association of the different peoples of the region, not only the Kel Tamashek, also Arab, Fula, Songhai peoples. Too many details to go into now. I'm just trying to give the kind of key, let's say, hints to get something of a grasp of the types of organizations that we're dealing with. A second example, crucial example for what I'm going to, for the last works I want to speak about tonight, is Dilar Dirik, who spoke here also at the Brussels summit, representative of the Kurdish women's movement. I don't know how many of you have followed what has been happening the past years in the Kurdish part of Syria, Rojava, northern part of Syria, what is currently happening in southeastern Turkey, which is actually North Kurdistan, Bakur, where the Kurds have been under sieged permanently, either by the Erdogan government, by Daesh, by the Islamic State, by the Assad regime. What was very important about the speech that Dilar gave when it comes to the Kurdish independence movement and the Kurdish women's movement in particular, what is very important is the model through which she introduced it. As you saw from the previous slide, all of the maps represent relatively clearly drawn territories that define the possible autonomy of the organization in question. In the case of Dilar, who was the last speaker, she came with this map, which does show the original territory of Kurdistan, but on top of it, something else emerges, something much more important, possibly, and that is an ideological map, as the actual structure through which she explains the belonging of the Kurdish people and its revolutionary movement. It is a map of democratic confederalism, which is also known as stateless democracy, which has a complex history, which will be difficult for me to summarize. But the key points to know is that the Kurdish revolutionary struggle started in 1978 with the foundation of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, today considered a terrorist organization, Marxist-Leninist party that struggled for an independent Kurdish nation state. Women were a crucial part of that movement from the very beginning. They were co-founders, they were fighters in the guerrilla forces, and along the way that this struggle developed, a critique began to emerge from the women's movement in relationship to the patriarchal culture within the PKK itself. The dominance of men in the leadership over women, but also the way that the very model of the nation state represents a set of patriarchal, territorial understandings, ideas, about what autonomy actually is. As a result, they started to articulate an alternative form, claiming that a people that has been suppressed by the state cannot find the state as its solution. The state, by definition, forms its problem. And the idea of democratic confederalism, of stateless democracy, came as an alternative, came as an answer to that. It is essentially democracy without the state. It is the idea that autonomy would be based on self-governance, on communal economy, on gender equality, and not on a centralized structure of governance. So it is a full rejection of the very idea that our identity, our autonomy would be defined by the model of the nation state. It is very complex. This is how far I can get in like a few minutes of summary. Now, in Bakur, in North Kurdistan, southeast Turkey, in the period of the guerrilla struggle, autonomous regions, autonomous zones have been established, but never on a large scale. When in 2012 the Syrian civil war started, the Arab Spring, Assad was drawn to the south of the country to fight the Free Syrian Army, leaving the north unprotected, which allowed the Kurds to reclaim their original part of West Kurdistan, Rojava. This is at the point of entry. And there they began to put into practice these ideals of stateless democracy on a massive scale. Massive in the sense we're talking about a landmass of about 1.5 times Belgium, 4.6 million inhabitants at the start of the revolution, but due to the many refugees, these are most probably much less, but there's not really a clear count of its current population. And my organization was invited to, after having learned from the Kurdish women's movement about this large-scale experiment in decentralized stateless democracy, to visit the region to see the new political, educational, economic institutions that were being built there. These are some of the images that I made during these research visits. And these are fighters of the women's protection units. Women are in every level of Rojavan society organized autonomously. They have their own political organizations, their own political parties, they have their own military, they have their own schools. In that sense, their struggle against patriarchy is institutionalized on every level of society. There's a 40% women quota for participation in political life. Every organization has a man and a woman as a president. So there's a whole set of radical institutional transformations taking place there. We see the examples of self-governance here in the city parliament of Gamishlo. I don't think it's an accident that it's a theater that's being used as a parliament, but maybe that's just me. And here the Women's Academy, an important science that came as a result of this revolution in Rojava, is the idea that the rejection of the state also allows for a rewriting of history, similar to what Upton Sinclair was arguing in relationship to art. The socialist revolution, revolutionary socialism, allows us to rethink the place of art in the world and thus reconsider art history. In this case, this takes place from a specific feminist perspective. The science that they've developed is called genealogy, science of women, which is an attempt to rewrite the history of mankind from the perspective of women as the first colonized class in history, and from there relate the struggle of women to those of minorities and stateless peoples. As a result of these many visits and exchanges with the autonomous region, this is the last part of my talk. I realize I have 3 minutes left to speak. The autonomous region, it's what is known as the democratic self-administration of Rojava. So these are all the assembled communes that self-govern the region, invited us to organize a summit in the autonomous region. That is relatively difficult in the sense that it is a very isolated region. It has Turkey on one side, which obviously bans Kurdish self-governance. There's the Assad regime on the other side. There's Daesh, Islamic State on the other side. The Iraqi government, which would be the only entry for economic and political exchange, is in alliance with the Erdogan regime in Turkey, so closes the border very often. So it is one of the main problems the region is facing is its incredible isolation. All the more important to attempt to build an exchange with other stateless autonomous movements in order to seek, in order to explore at what level this ideal of stateless democracy, this ideal of self-governance, could form a paradigm for other movements from all over the world. So they invited us to bring our network to the Rojava region, but, and this was a demand from Amina Osse, a Minister of Foreign Affairs of the administration and our main collaborator, and then if we would build a parliament, it would have to be a permanent parliament and not a temporary parliament in a theater. She argued it was logical that we made temporary temporary parliaments for stateless peoples in states that we do not abide to, but in this case, seeing that they are already a stateless region, it would also be a stateless parliament. This resulted in a collaboration between my organization and the autonomous democratic self-administration of Rojava in developing what we decided would have to be a public parliament. This was one of the main arguments, I think, from Amina that formed the key start of this project, namely that the moment Rojava declared itself a stateless democracy, essentially all the parliaments in that region became stateless parliaments. They were no longer the symbols of a centralized government. They became the symbols of local self-organized communities and cooperatives. They became public spaces. And this, I think, this was a key trigger for us to rethink the parliament a step further than what we had done so far. What is the parliament if we can think it as a public space, as a common space? And that resulted in this literal public parliament. This is the design, a circular form, something between a sculpture and an actual public space in the city of Derek. It's in the eastern part of the Rojava Autonomous Region, modeled after the Agora, which for the Kurdish revolutionary movement is a very important reference when it comes to the foundations of democracy as assembly, democracy as a form of gathering, democracy as a common performance, democracy also as a performance or as a practice in which the person represented and the person representing are part of the same community, in which the alienation between those who speak on behalf of the people and the people itself is minimized to a maximum. A parliament also in which the center of power is never occupied, in which the relationships between the participants of the parliament are always on equal terms. So there's even a mathematical dimension to this idea of stateless democracy. It is a parliament that in that sense comes as the direct visual expression of a set of new ideas that became possible through this revolution. The revolutionary imaginary creates a space through which art, architecture, design can reinvent itself and the result is the idea, the concept of a public parliament. There's many symbolic aspects to this design, from the pillars that represent different key values, key terms from the revolutionary movement, from what they call the social contract, essentially the constitution of the democratic self-administration, in all the languages of the peoples from the region, Arab, Assyrian, Kurdish. On top of the parliament is a series of fragments of flags from all the local self-governing institutions, organizations, cooperatives from that specific region, together forming a new confederate whole, and the confederation obviously being a key term in what connects all of these different communes in the region. And we started the construction in August last year. From the basic, what is interesting actually about seeing the construction take place step by step is that it also follows, let's say, it's very much an ideological architecture. So there's a logic from the base to the top. From the base, which is the agora, as I just explained, to the pillars, which are the values upon which the self-administration is run, to the placement of the flags, which is the confederation that practices it. So in the process of construction, you also literally see the discourse, the set of ideals behind the parliaments emerge. Here, the first celebration at the start of construction. For this occasion, we brought a first group of representatives of other stateless political movements to Rojava, from Scotland, from Catalonia, from the Amazigh community in Libya, as a first chance to begin an exchange about what this parliament could be, not just a parliament as a parliament for the Kurdish people, but also as a parliament that would symbolize the possibility of a different form of world governance. Here, Abdullah Abdul on the right, an artist that I work with, Kurdish artist I work with very closely, who has helped us to design and realize the parliament. And here some of its, from the latest images in December. We are still busy with the construction. Its official inauguration will be in April next year with a second summit, which in this case will also take place in the parliament itself. And as such, is a direct attempt to bring into practice the idea that the parliament is both a symbol or a place of assembly for the local population, for the local communes that self-govern the region, but could also be a point of orientation for other stateless and autonomous movements from all over the world. So, to come back to the starting question, how to make a world. Obviously, this is not yet a world. This is one of many worlds in the making. I hope that maybe also came through from all of the different maps that I showed you, and from the few examples that I was able to give a little bit of context to, is that as much as we are led to believe that the world that we are living in is at least the lesser of many evils, this is not true. There are many new worlds being built right in front of our eyes. Some are very close. The Greek Spring would be a very good example of that, most recently. Some might seem farther away when it comes to the Kurdish revolutionary movement that I now elaborated on a little bit, but they're here, right in front of our eyes, including all of their diasporas, their ideas, their visions, their imaginaries. And with the possibility of all of these new worlds, also comes the possibility of many new arts. But then it must be our task as artists to recognize them, to dare to see them, to visualize them, to ally with them, to stand in solidarity, and to choose our place in the world. We cannot be political artists without taking political positions. Or in other words, in the words of Upton Sinclair, all art presupposes a political position. Not fighting the status quo is a way of being implicated and complicit to it. So with our choice of being artists, there should also be a choice of the kind of world in which we want to be artists. Thank you.